the rise of the far right across Europe and the possible threats that could entail, including, and it's, I think, if I'm correct, Emmanuel Macron, who's warned that Europe has never been more at risk because of the instability that is being sown by certain political elements within the bloc, some of them at the behest, whether knowingly or not, of Vladimir Putin, to create a kind of instability within this continent. Let's, without any further delay, bring in our guest, Dr Marta Lorimer, who's a fellow in European politics at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Dr Lorimer, thank you very much for being with us here on France 24. We appreciate your time. The rise of the far right across Europe, is this an exaggeration or a genuine threat? What's your take?
So it's not an exaggeration to say that far-right parties are on the rise in Europe. Whether they present or not a threat and what kind of threat really depends on where we're looking at and how big the party is, how much power they have, and how its adversaries are dealing with it.
Is one of the issues that the far right is becoming normalised? And with that, is there a parallel to be made with the 1930s in Europe?
So yes, so it's absolutely true that the far right has become increasingly normalized. So if you look at just about 30 years ago, far right parties were fairly rare across Europe, and they weren't particularly successful. Most importantly, they were really ostracized by other political parties who refused to work with them. Now, this is increasingly changing because far right parties are becoming bigger. They are becoming more successful, and other political parties are more willing to not just collaborate with them, but actually push forwards their ideas. Whether it is wise at the moment to draw parallels with the 1930s is probably not something I would feel comfortable doing. But generally speaking, we can say that the far right has been normalized.
We could pick any country, couldn't we? But let's start with France, because clearly in France, we can say that once upon a time, voters said never the National Front. The National Front is now called the National Rally, Rassemblement National. We've gone from Le Pen, père, the father Le Pen, Jean-Marie Le Pen, to Marine Le Pen, and now Jordan Bardella leading the party, giving it a different face, a different look, a different feeling. And if we believe the polls, it looks like they're going to clean up in the European elections. Should that be a cause for concern?
The National Rally is definitely going to be doing very well in the European elections. As you've said, the party has gone through a transition. Much of its ideas have remained the same. But it has become much more normal, again, a normal figure in French politics. And Marine Le Pen has definitely done a lot to make her party look more respectable. How will they do in the European election isn't particularly concerning to the extent that they will only be sending a delegation to the European Parliament. And we know that far-right parties in the European Parliament are not a united front. But it will be interesting to see what happens after the European elections and what lessons are learned from a National Rally victory in the European Parliament elections.
The Netherlands. Some people see the Netherlands as a place of greater mellowness, people who are very, very affable, great to get on with. But they've, turned towards the far right. Geert Wilders now occupying a role that many people thought would have been impossible 10 years ago.
Yes, exactly. So the Netherlands is another case where we've seen the far right do particularly well. Now, what's interesting about the Netherlands is that the far right there has been doing well, but again, we've seen it do well in certain elections, then more poorly in other elections. Then we've seen splinter groups appearing. And then what we've seen with the attempts to form a government by Wilders is that there are still moderate or at least more centrist parties that are refusing to work with the far right, in spite of the fact that they have, by and large, copied some of its messages.
Italy, for example, electing a far-right government there, and then people think about what happened pre-war, 1930s, rise of Mussolini. Now we have a situation with another far-right administration, Giorgia Meloni there. But Giorgia Meloni taking a different tack to what was expected over the issue of Ukraine. Is this a sign that the far-right today perhaps has a different way of dealing with matters?
I think it tells us more about the fact that Meloni has decided to tackle her international politics in a way that essentially creates the least problem possible. So we have to be very mindful of what these parties are doing, not just internationally, but also at home.
And the very fact that we're having this discussion in some way maybe points to a kind of normalisation of far-right politics, which many people feel very uncomfortable with. But is this a reality that we need to accept today, do you think?
It is certainly a reality that we have to come to terms with, to the extent that we have to accept that far-right parties are here. They're probably here to stay because their voters aren't really going anywhere. Now, the question is really, how do you deal with it? And this is where probably more mainstream and centrist politicians have to think about the fact that the way you deal with the far right isn't really by copying their messages, but by trying to address the root causes of their success.
Because the issue, I suppose, Dr. Lorimer, is that people are looking for answers, people are looking for solutions. And if the mainstream political parties aren't doing that, then they turn to alternatives. That's a fair assumption, isn't it?
Yes, it is a fair assumption. And I think one of the reasons why many voters have turned to the far right recently is because they feel that some of their concerns aren't really being addressed. And these are not just cultural concerns about the rise of migration, for example, but also economic concerns. And this is where mainstream politicians can perhaps try and make a difference, and really try and make sure that there are social services that work for everyone, that finding housing is possible, rather than just saying, let's close borders.
And these parties often benefit from perception, don't they? I'm thinking of the UK, where many people who perhaps vote for the Conservatives at best, maybe a bit further, if necessary, Brexit Party, whatever it wants to call itself these days, they will say that it's only a small island, it's been overrun by migrants, whereas the reality, of course, is anything but. There are far greater numbers of migrants going to other countries, and other countries doing far more to help migrants, more than Britain. But it's about this perception, isn't it, about the use of the media by these parties, dare I suggest, even foreign propaganda elements using social media to sort of push that same message.
Yes, it's not just about the objective reality of migration, but it is also about the extent to which the issue has become politicized, not just in the media, but also by politicians specifically, who have really responded to far-right attempts to make this an issue. Whereas we know that voters don't just care about issues by themselves, they also care about issues when these are addressed by politicians more broadly.
Can I talk about Hungary? Hungary's leader, Viktor Orbán, seen as an ally of Vladimir Putin. His politics, you could say, extreme, perhaps to the far right in terms of the idea of nationalism as something that he's clung to quite doggedly, the idea of putting up a fence to stop migrants getting in, that kind of thing. Is this part of what observers are saying is destabilising Europe? Giorgia Meloni deciding to actually back Ukraine in the effort to help Ukraine. Viktor Orbán, perhaps one of these people who's actually, well, he's actually spoken out against it to say, no, the aid shouldn't go to Ukraine. Is this something that is actually sort of causing fragility at the heart of Europe?
This is perhaps something that is also causing fragility at the heart of the far right itself, precisely because when we worry about far right parties all coming together to destroy the European Union, or to push forward some kind of policy, we do tend to forget that they also have very diverse visions, both of Europe and of certain issues that really affect Europe. So precisely on the issue of Ukraine, for example, this is something that is likely to stand in the way of the far right creating a single group in the European Parliament after the elections, because there are people like Meloni who are very much in favor of keeping support to Ukraine, whereas there are political parties like Fidesz, but also the Lega in Italy or the Rassemblement National in France, who are much more skeptical about providing aid to Ukraine.
Do you see these parties as a risk to the future of the EU, a risk even to the future of NATO? And into that equation, we could also throw Donald Trump, couldn't we? Because if Trump, if the election would happen today, Trump would be elected as leader of the United States. That might, of course, create a different kind of calculation about how Ukraine is supported in its war effort, how NATO is supported by the United States. It might change the equation completely.
It might change the equation completely, or it might not. This is precisely the problem. If someone had asked about 2 years ago what Giorgia Meloni was going to be doing about NATO, we probably would have expected her to withdraw Italian support from Ukraine, for example, or to adopt an anti-NATO position. That's not really what she's done. So these parties could represent a threat to Europe, that's for sure. But I am not convinced that they would actually push for a complete demise of European institutions, because parties like Orban's Fidesz, for example, really get a lot out of the EU.
Dr Marta Lorimer, thank you very much indeed for joining us from the London School of Economics for that dissection of the rise of the far right. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your analysis. Thank you for joining us here on France 24 for our apropos slot. Thank you for watching too. Do stay with us. We have much